China's going through an evolutionary process. Think about this. Here's a country that's been growing at almost 10% a year for 3 decades. What does conventional wisdom say in our textbooks about growth and development? It says you need the rule of law. You need strong institutions. You need inclusive institutions to grow rapidly, validated across many country experiences. So how come a country with, frankly, limited development of rule of law, relatively weak, or what I call institutions which are not quite right, limited accountability in some ways, grow at 10% a year for 3 decades? Okay, so what is it that makes China different from an India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Colombia, or Africa, or Nigeria? 2 things. Extraordinarily competitive economy because it competes externally, always open in terms of trade. Secondly, extraordinarily competitive internally because the provinces compete against each other. You have 25, 30 provinces. They both operate, they invest, they do businesses. And you have state enterprises and you have private firms. They all compete. In India, the states do not compete with each other. Now, how does a province compete? A province competes because it supports economic activity, but it competes because the head of the province, the party secretary of a province, or the governor of the province doesn't come from the province. He's appointed from Beijing with the mandate that he needs to basically develop, improve, and do something to get the conditions better. He's competing with leaders elsewhere, and if he succeeds, he gets promoted. So somebody like Xi Jinping has worked in 4 or 5 major leadership positions in different parts of China, and if he does well, gets promoted. This creates a competition that you do not see. That's very different. Now, your question about whether this can continue is a very interesting and difficult question. There's a lot of what I call issues of social tensions. China measures or records the numbers of social incidents. A social incident is when more than 2 or 3 people get together and protest. It could be trivial. It could be a family argument if you have a big enough family. It could be an argument of a firm, whatever it is. 10 years ago, that number would be something like 30, 40,000 protests a year. That's a lot, but you have a big country, okay? And it got close to 100,000, and they stopped publishing this number, okay? It's very large. Social protests and the cost of dealing with social protests in China is expensive. So the cost of the internal security, maintenance of the internal security, grows rapidly. It's an economic issue. It's an economic issue because that cost is greater than the cost of supporting China's military. So here we are in the West. We worry about these battleships, these planes, these other things. What we don't realize is, and the money is pouring into that, which is monitored by the Washington Authority, the Defense Department. The internal security costs in China now exceed the army and the military costs. So this is a big issue. There's so many protests going on. Now here's the interesting question. What does conventional wisdom say about protests? When we talk about protests, Arab Spring, Thailand, Indonesia, we ask the question, is this going to be destabilizing? Is this going to bring down the regime? So you see lots of articles which talk about potentially destabilizing the situation in China. And the great irony is this kind of view is wrong. Protests in China, in a historical view, has helped strengthen the top leadership. Protests in other countries tends to weaken the top leadership. How can that be? Okay? And the answer is because China is a huge country which is regionally decentralized. So protests tend to be against local officials who are accused of being unfair, not behaving properly, or corrupt, or whatever it is. So you're protesting against local officials, and in desperation at the very end, you actually appeal to the leadership in Beijing to help. This actually strengthens. They tend to be seen as the savior of the country rather than the force which might be driving the consequence. So this is what I would call why the regime has been very, very strong, actually, very successful in keeping the system going. Protest is actually the substitute for, in some ways, the rule of law or demonstrations because it gives a signal to the government of what is the problem, and then they can deal with it. So this is very unusual. But the question, however, is can this continue?
Yep.
Right?
And it's also, I think, the question of what kind of a drag it produces for China's economy over time.
And as I said to you, the economic cost of this is significant. The frictional cost now, as the economy becomes more complicated, it becomes more services-oriented, less industrial-oriented, it is an issue. In my book, I basically talk about what are the likely forces that would drive what I would call political liberalization over the longer term. And I spent a lot of time reading about political scientists writing about democracy, human rights, and case examples of what might be the path for China. And again, my book says that's conventional wisdom. It's totally wrong. What would be the right comparators for China?